On one hand, we have these three different topics: customer centricity, customer-based corporate valuation, and e-commerce acquisition and performance marketing more generally. They sound kind of different from each other, especially the second and third. Like, what would financial valuation have to do with performance marketing? And that's why the customer centricity piece, I think, is key, is that it really is, each of these other pieces can stand on by itself, but customer-centric strategies are the glue that both motivates these things, brings them together, and actually helps us to use common frameworks to evaluate and again, integrate different kinds of activities that might be done by people in completely different parts of the organization. So this is my job right over here, is to set the stage and to talk about how the world has changed and is constantly changing. Which is to say, if you look at most companies on the planet, big and small, young and old, public and private, products and services, B2B, B2C, I don't care. They usually grow and find success through two different approaches. One of them would be to say that we are the best. We develop the very best products and services. We're very innovative. We know how to be different from and stay ahead of our competitors. And even if our products aren't necessarily any better, we can create perceptions of it. So if you want the best, you're going to come to us. And in the old days, that was kind of the only way of doing business. It was just coming up with a better mousetrap and so on. I mean, if you think about a phrase like that, we always focus on coming up with a better mousetrap. We rarely focus on coming up with a more efficient mousetrap, or coming up with as many mousetraps as we can, as quickly and as cheaply as possible. But very quickly, over the last couple of decades, this idea of scale has not only become kind of understood and popular, but essential. And so business is all about either coming up with the best thing, or taking whatever thing you have, even if it's just, pretty good, but bringing it to market, bringing it to customers as quickly, cheaply, frictionlessly as possible. You understand that. Okay, every one of your companies has been pretty good at both, and presumably among world class at least one of these things. But the problem is the world is changing, and it's much harder to break out of the pack on either of these dimensions than it was before. And why is that? It's because every one of us, every company is chasing after these same objectives, and so we can innovate faster. Let's do some blue ocean strategies or some design thinking. And you think, and I'm not being critical of those things, but the problem is that everybody's going after them. You have these different flavors of the month, and it's just very hard to find sustaining opportunities to be different from everyone, whether it comes to differentiation or scale. These things are commoditizing, and it's just harder to achieve the kinds of growth that your internal and external stakeholders demand, but I think that there is a way out. And by the way, this way out isn't necessarily new. So here's a diagram taken from a book written 26 years ago that at least tipped its cap to the idea of having a third dimension. Some of you might be familiar with this book. If you're not, don't worry about it. It's ancient. But the whole idea is that there are three dimensions, right? It's all about being a product leader or operation efficient, and or being, what you can see the words here, customer intimate, customer responsive. But the problem is, if you were to read a book like this, or pretty much anything that's been written until very recently, the words that we would say about this third dimension would be somewhat ambiguous, they'd be somewhat pandering, they'd be somewhat untrue, and they'd be somewhat ineffective as an overarching strategy. See, the whole idea of being intimate with and responsive to every one of your customers, the idea of not sleeping at night until the least happy customer is satisfied, is irresponsible. You can't love all your customers, and you can't have all your customers love you. That just in scale, it's just not right. It's a nice thing to kind of maybe put in a Super Bowl advertisement, but it really isn't an appropriate way to run a business. And why is that? Well, part of it is that it has very low return on investment. And part of that is when we just face the reality of it, the idea of taking every one of those customers and have them love you, it's really, really, really difficult to do that. It's really expensive. It's impossible. And so we should really break away from this pack of having everyone just love us, and the customer is at the center of everything that we do. And instead, we should focus on the idea that not all customers are created equal. And if we can really understand the difference across them, that's going to be the key. If we can figure out who are the right customers, who we should be centered around, instead of being centered around the customer in some faceless, nameless, ambiguous, one-size-fits-all kind of way. And that's what I'm talking about, this idea of customer centricity. Some of you might be familiar with my work, a couple of books that I've written. I'm very serious about this idea. These are words that I put out there over 10 years ago. This is what I mean by customer centricity. It's not that the customer is the center of everything that we do, but there's a select set of customers, that not all customers are created equal. And if we can figure out who the best ones are and use them as the way to guide everything we do, from product development to product delivery to finance, that we can make more money in a sustainable, defendable, ethical way than focusing on the product or focusing on the delivery and development of the product. Of course, the challenge with it, you look at these words and you say, wait a minute, well, that's not how we roll. Wait a minute, we can't do that. Because the big challenge is, who would be that select set? How can we pick and choose? Is it possible for us to do that? Is it possible for us to defend that? And I say the answer is yes. And I stand by the concept of customer lifetime value. And I spent so much of my career taking these words and making them very tangible, very meaningful, very specific, very actionable. It's not just some ambiguous concept out there. It's something that we can do in a very, very accountable manner. And it's actually surprisingly easy. You look at the basic issues over here. If we can predict how long the customer is going to stay with us and how many purchases they're going to make and how much value we're going to extract from each of those purchases, then we can project overall customer lifetime value. And we can do that at a very granular level. And we can do that for every kind of company, for every business sector. Instead of just having a single lifetime value model, the challenge, the opportunity, the thing that I find interesting and fun is to figure out how to bring these concepts to life, okay, for every different kind of business. So I'll give you an example over here. For pharmaceuticals, it's not just a matter of squeezing as much money as we can out of our physicians or patients. It's a matter of other things that would enhance their life. And I mean that in a very literal way. So I'm trying to emphasize that it's not a one-size-fits-all model, but at the same time, a lot of companies that have said, well, our business is different. It's not as different as you think. We really got to stop with those excuses. And we've had great success with it. Dan and I co-founded a company back in 2014, Zodiac, where we brought lifetime value to life at full commercial scale, got away from the excuses, got away from the reasons not to do it, and worked with a wide variety of companies, from retail to pharmaceuticals to telcos to hospitality to gaming, you name it. If you have customers, they have value, we can calculate. And if you look at this diagram right in the middle of the slide over here, you'll notice an interesting shape. And this is the way it always looks. Again, B2B, B2C, I don't care, big or small, that most of your customers are not that valuable. But then there's that green bar on the right. And if you find the words customer centricity ambiguous, you won't find ambiguous the subtitle of my first book, Focus on the Right Customers for Strategic Advantage. If we can understand who are the customers in that big green bar on the right, what makes them different, either in terms of how they look, how they behave, in terms of how they use our product, in terms of how we acquired them. If we can understand what makes that select set different and do more for them and acquire more like them, that's where growth comes in a way that I really do believe, and I have evidence to really support it, that's much more profitable, sustainable, defendable, and ethical than simply doubling down on product development alone. And one of the success stories among the many other companies that we work with is the company that ended up buying this enterprise, Nike. That almost exactly 3 years ago, Nike bought Zodiac and has achieved amazing things with their transformation to be digital first. It was a transformation they were on before they bought Zodiac, a transformation that's really gone to great heights since then. Can't take all the credit for it, but it's been wonderful to be part of it. And it really was a great outcome for Dan and myself. Instead of it being either itty bitty little teeny tiny digitally native companies, not that there's anything wrong with them, great big company choosing to transform itself and doing so from a position of strength and opportunity as opposed to desperation and nothing else is working. It was really great. One other point that I want to make over here, well, a couple of more points. If you go back to that diagram about what customers are worth, what about all those customers on the left, those low value ones? Do we ignore them? Do we fire them? Do we try to shoo them away on their own? No. That a really important point here is to find this just right balance between focusing on the growth of that big green bar on the right, but the care and feeding of those other customers. It might not be the same. We might not give them, the same red carpet treatment that we give to the good customers, but they are important. And here's why. Because those so-so customers will help us fund the growth. They will help us keep the business open. They will help us pay for our employees while we're figuring out how to double down on those very good customers. So there really is a balance to be found there. And we really want to come up with tactics, metrics, language, culture in order to find that way of kind of being two companies at one that's doing, a pretty good but cost-effective job of managing relationships with most of the customers while finding growth and accelerating that growth with the just right ones. But the main point here is don't overinvest in them. Okay, don't fire them, don't get rid of them, recognize their value, but do the kinds of things that are in line with that value instead of overdoing it. Turns out it's not that easy to do. When we first founded Zodiac, when I first started developing all these lifetime value models, I had this impression that if I give every company the lifetime value magic wand and they could wave it, that money will just come raining down from the sky. It's not that easy. Turns out it's pretty hard to actually create a customer-centric organizational structure, customer-centric corporate culture, customer-centric employee base, customer-centric communications with external stakeholders. And so much of my life since coming up with these models has been a quest to find out the ways to make them most acceptable, to get companies willing to give it a try. And being a marketing professor, so much of that would start with marketing. That if I could work my way up from the analytics people to the product people, the sales people, and work my way up to the CMO, then I will have victory. Then I'll have these words at the C-suite. And with all due respect to marketing, that's not enough. And so one of the things that I found, and again, I have to really hand it to my former PhD student, my co-author and my co-founder, Dan McCarthy, to talk about a surprising way to get the conversation going. Instead of starting with marketing, let's start with finance. You see, he was a finance guy before coming back to get his PhD in marketing and becoming a marketing professor, and really helped take these words, customer-based corporate valuation, and again, make them very tangible, make them very actionable. And if you think about it, at the surface, it's the same basic idea. That if we can project how many customers they're going to acquire and how long they're going to stay and what they're going to do over that horizon, how much they're going to spend when they do, not only are those relevant things to do for marketing purposes, but that also underlies all of our revenue and cash flow. So we can start to reframe these models towards finance. Let's win over the CFO in addition to, or maybe even before we go after the CMO. And I'm going to hand things off to Dan to talk about this idea of CBCV, customer-based corporate valuation. Dan, take it away.
All right. Well, let me share my screen too. Just give me one sec over here. Okay. And there we go. All right, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. Yeah, great to be with you. As Pete's saying, I think there's a real opportunity to actually get into the marketing department, but by doing so, by winning over the CFO. And so a big question then is, how does the CFO think about the business? Yeah, I think we in marketing have spent a lot of time and energy trying to come up with our own homebrewed way of thinking about the value of a company. And I think it's a very helpful, very instructive exercise. But if you really want to win over the CFO, I think one of the most effective ways of doing so is by taking their established frameworks, especially if it has to do with valuation, and showing how we can augment that. And so that's basically what we're going to try and do through CBCV. And so how does the CFO think about valuation? Well, if you open up any standard corporate valuation textbook, it's going to break down the value of a firm into three pieces: the operating assets, the non-operating assets, and the net debt. And the key point that we make is, for one, the most important and most difficult thing to value is the value of these operating assets. And so what we're going to do is we're going to basically take whatever transactional data the company may have available, take all that data and all the CRM data, and just do a better prediction of what the value of the operating assets are worth by incorporating in these highly validated models for what these customers will do. And so, typically a CFO is going to spend virtually no time mining a transaction log to be able to understand, say, what they're going to do over the next year, 2 years, 5 years. And there's just gold in that data. So we want to be able to use that and bring that into the model. So again, we're going to take the exact same valuation framework that the CFO already has come to know and love, and we're just going to make it that much more accurate. So how are we going to do that? We're going to basically do it by predicting revenues and ultimately predicting what cash flows will be more accurately. So this is kind of a step-by-step process for how we think about how customers can be worked into that revenue prediction model. Step number one is basically predicting the flow of customers over time. How many customers we're going to acquire period by period, and how long those customers will stay. That's going to basically give us, if we had a crystal ball that told us acquisition retention, that's going to give us the size of the customer base in all future periods. If I then knew, as Pete was saying, how many purchases those customers will make while they're with the firm and how much they're going to spend on each of the purchases, it's basically an accounting identity that gives us period by period revenues. Now, there's a lot of valuation models that basically go off of either revenues or some measure of profitability, whether it's gross profit, EBIT, EBITDA, you name it. So basically everything from sales on down, we're going to pretty much rely on what finance professionals already do. The bulk of the increase in accuracy of our models is going to come from our ability to forecast what revenues will be more accurately than they otherwise would have had they just kind of done the usual kind of top-down approach. So everything else, again, kind of flows very naturally. It's stuff that you can find in any standard corporate valuation textbook or class. And all that we're saying is, if we have a model for customer acquisition, customer retention, customer ordering, and how much is spent on each of those orders, then we will predict revenues more accurately than the CFO otherwise would. So that's going to be what we're going to do. And again, Pete had mentioned Zodiac. The sort of models that we're using here are identical to the models that we had used at Zodiac. Obviously, they've been enhanced since then. I guess, except with the exception of the acquisitions process. That typically, if we're working with the marketing department, what we're helping them understand is the value of all of their existing customers. So the thing that's a little bit different here conceptually is we're going to actually forecast future acquisitions as well to say, we may not have these customers yet, but we know in the next couple of quarters, we're going to acquire this many more people. And that's going to help us get kind of a pretty crucial ingredient for what revenues will be in those future periods as well. So again, this is what our second company has done. Zodiac, we sold it to Nike. The following month, we started Theta Equity Partners. It just does customer-based corporate valuation. That's all that we do. We do it for companies. We do it for private equity firms. We do it for other investment firms. We do it for consulting firms. Name a business that doesn't care about valuation, and that's who we wouldn't be applicable for. But again, valuation is so central to everything that a company is about that we've actually found greater success with companies than we had when we tried to market directly to their marketing departments. So I'm going to bring this to life with just one example. This is an example from a private equity client that we had worked with. And I think it's instructive to think through what the approach was. As you're thinking about CBCV, let's say that you would potentially be interested in learning more about your value through this lens, what's the process that it would take? It's very easy. Basically, we would love to speak with you over the course of a couple of conversations. Typically, we would better understand kind of what you're looking for, what your pain points are, and we could help you understand how this customer-centric way of thinking about valuation could be useful. That would really drive the scope of the work that we would perform. Once we have that nailed down, then the basic thing that we need is just access to your data. It could be granular. In this example, it's going to be all of the transactional data for the firm in question, but it could also be aggregate. And many firms, for whatever reason, whether it's privacy, whether it's they're doing competitive intelligence, and so they don't have the transaction log, it's totally fine. We can help you understand just what aggregate data we would need to be able to come up with predictions that'd be pretty much just as accurate as the ones we would have gotten if we had the granular data anyways. Then the ball's firmly in our court. We're going to fit a series of models that are cohort specific. By cohort, I mean, in that flow chart, we're going to get separate predictions for every single group of acquired customers. We're going to predict what they'll do in the future. And then we're going to basically sum up all of the activity across all the customers to understand the bottom line company level outputs that we're interested in. We're then going to use those models to get these deeper insights. So we come up with our predictions, and then we want to say, well, what is this telling us about how healthy this firm is? And so that's kind of typically the bulk of the work on our side. Then we deliver the results. So it could be in the form of Tableau, through a dashboard. It could be through a PowerPoint. Whatever you think would be most effective at socializing the results within the firm. We're very happy to do that. So again, we're going to bring it to life with this private equity example. They were doing diligence on a company that was bricks and clicks. So they operated through their website, but they also had a whole bunch of company-owned stores. It was a reasonably sized, but somewhat small company. So we had, again, all of their data going back to when they first began operations. In this case, it was about 5+ years worth of data, which represented 2 million customers and more than 10 million transactions. So the first thing that we'll often do is just kind of get a sense for how the data sits before we even run any predictive models. So what this is showing here is just a time series plot for customer acquisitions over time. Again, just to protect the innocent, we don't share client results with anyone else unless we have explicit approval to do so. That's why we don't see a y-axis over here. But what we can see is this business has been growing fairly healthily, fairly linearly, actually, over the past handful of years. One thing that was really nice about this business, as we can see from this chart, is that a majority of their contribution profit, is coming from existing customers. So each of these bars is basically saying, give me the revenue, give me the total contribution profit each different period, and then show me how much of that, what percent of that is coming from repeat customers who've made purchases before, that's what we see in dark blue, versus first-time buyers, which is what we see in light blue. And we can see it's pretty much hovered at around 70% over the past couple of years. And what this implies is that the cash flows should be steadier, that if you have a lot of your business coming from customers who've been with you for quite a while, typically it's a lot easier to predict what they're going to do in the future. And so we would expect just more overall stability to cash flows going into the future. It also means that they're not stuck on what we call the acquisitions treadmill, where just to kind of keep even, they need to bring in a whole bunch of new customers every single period. That's a very expensive growth. So again, it just kind of gives us a high-level overview of how the company's doing. We fit a series of predictive models. What we can see on the right over here, the rightmost column is just taking all the customers that were born in the second quarter of 2017 with this relatively short runway, just all the data up to that vertical dotted line. Let's predict what they're going to do into the future. And it's only after we validate these models and feel good about our predictions that we'll trust the results for customer lifetime value and for revenues. So we can see over here, even with a very short runway, we can make very accurate predictions. The column on the left over here is basically looking at all of the customers across all the different acquisition cohorts. So again, we can see that we kind of aggregate our predictions across the cohorts, our predictions are really good. We can see from this chart, again, this is kind of moving from validation to insights. And what this is showing us is what we call the post-acquisition value, the average value of customers after they've been acquired by acquisition cohort. And what's fairly striking here is how boring this plot is. Basically, the customers have been generally worth about $270, and that really hasn't changed over the past handful of years. And again, this gives us confidence that as long as there's no majorly disruptive changing event that's going to happen into the future, we feel pretty good about the predictions that we'd make for the valuation of customers in 2019 and beyond. So that's how much we get in value after the customer's been acquired. We then subtract off how much we spent to acquire them. That's what gets us customer lifetime value. And that's what also gets us, from what we see over here, the marketing return on investment. So, we can see they're making back about, again, $270 after customers are acquired. They've been spending about, $30, $35 to bring them in. That's a very healthy return on investment. So, we can see that it's been holding up fairly consistently over the past couple of years, which again leads us to conclude that the unit economic health of this firm is pretty good. This is one of the very interesting things that we can derive from the model now that we've got these insights. We can say, I know the valuation of the customers. Let's understand how that value varies as a function of other things that we know about the customers. So what we're seeing over here on the left is, imagine that we took just the very first product that these customers bought, and we said, I'm going to get the average value of the customers as a function of that first product category. We can see very significant differences in the valuation of customers as a function of that first product purchase. Again, this is giving us very diagnostic insight into, say, what we should emphasize on the landing page of the company's website, for merchandising and things like that. The chart on the right is basically looking at the motion picture view of the bar chart on the left. This is saying, let's look at how valuable, how good these customers are that made these first purchases in these different product lines across acquisition cohorts. So we can see product one, that dark blue line, those customers have actually been getting better over time. Whereas product number 5, the people coming in through product number 5, those customers have been getting steadily worse over time. So this leads us to be even more confident that we would want to, all else being equal, emphasize a bit more product 1 over product 5. We can also look at, again, things like slicing the data by whether the customer came in online versus in store. Obviously, another slice of the data could be the acquisition channel that we acquired the customer through if they were acquired through an online channel. What we can see over here for bricks versus clicks is customers that came in through the bricks, that came in through a physical store, tended to be a lot more valuable, and that incremental profitability has been very consistent over time. So the bar chart on the left is saying the average customer that comes in through our website is worth about $190. That goes up to about $280 for customers that came in through a physical store. And the chart on the right is showing, again, that same result by acquisition cohort. And this is saying, if anything, the customers coming in through the website have been getting less valuable over time. And this is before we even consider acquisition costs, which you got to imagine has been getting steadily more expensive for that online channel because of the rising cost of paid ads. So just kind of at a high level, again, we think that these insights are extremely valuable. They're telling us very important things about the overall health of firms. I think these are useful both for people within marketing, but then also for people within finance. They want to know, am I stepping on a landmine, a unit economic landmine, when I'm making an investment in this firm? We've done now way more than dozens. We've done over 100 different diligences like the one that we just showed here. So if this is something that you'd be interested in, please reach out. We think this is going to be a standard for everybody who's involved with valuation. So we really do, we called it a revolution on our landing page that I showed before. really do believe it is a revolution. So here's some additional resources for those who are interested. Obviously, I know we've thrown a lot at you. Very happy to share a copy of this deck to the extent that that would be helpful. Just don't hesitate to reach out. But and next, we're going to talk about how we can link valuation to kind of the management of that value. But I think that's something that Andy is much more of an expert in than I am. So thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dan and Peter. So Peter actually made a case for customer centricity, and Dan explained how companies are being valued today. And it's less about just pure revenue growth, but rather the value of each individual customer and what they are going to do in the future. And it's quite remarkable that in times where everyone understands the value of customer lifetime value, that on the marketing side, we are still operating in this old world. And essentially what we are all doing, or most companies, they optimize campaigns for plain revenue. So what I wanted to do, instead of having a lengthy introduction and making a case for CLV-driven advertising, I wanted to let some numbers speak for themselves. So what we see here is a comparison. It's actually a side-by-side test we did. A couple of weeks ago, we got the numbers back, and it compares a revenue optimization with a CLV optimization approach. In this case, it was a paid search account where we activated CLV data in the Google auction time bidding. And what we see here is the blue bar is the revenue optimization approach, which ran in parallel in a geo split, and the orange bar is the CLV optimization approach. So what you can see is that the CLV optimization spent roughly 19% less so the budget was 90% lower, and we got almost to the same net sales result. But what's really interesting is then you can see that on the margin side, the CLV approach was already ahead because margins were made available. And then the massive impact was on the customer acquisition side, where we could achieve a 59% increase in new customer acquisition. And if you build a combined KPI of margins and expected future margins which will come in, you see roughly 20% lower spend and almost 50% higher CLV. So it's clearly, it has a massive impact. And you can do this not only in paid search, you can do this in any biddable media channel, whether it's Facebook or Instagram or programmatic. We've seen quite similar results. So it's actually something which really can move the needle, but it also requires a fundamentally different approach, which I'm gonna explain further down the road. But let's get into my slides and put this into perspective. So what Dan just explained is how to execute the customer-based corporate valuation approach. And it's a more accurate way to value companies. It's a descriptive approach though. So what we'd like to do now is take a look at what can actually be done on the marketing side to drive more performance and ultimately increase the corporate valuation. So we divided this in 2 subsequent steps. So here, the middle column, step 2, which is we'd like to first gain an understanding of what's actually possible if we pivot from a revenue focus, like we have a certain given budget and try to maximize revenue. We want to see what uplift potential do we have across all different marketing channels to make a case for a different type of optimization rationale. And then we take a brief look at what actually needs to be done in order to make this happen and execute. So let's start with the assessment first. So what we do in order to get a sense for the uplift potential is actually 3 steps. The first one is we always take historical information, so we travel back in time, but then instead of just looking at plain top line revenue, we want to go to the bottom of the order profitability actually. So we take the net revenue and factor out costs of goods sold, factor out any variable order related costs to get a sense for what the true margin actually was in a specific time frame in the past. So this is actually gives us a much better sense for the true impact, but still based on the first order. And if a company sells, let's say, underwear and laptops, the margins are fundamentally different, maybe 70% on the underwear and less than 10% on laptops. So revenue is just a really bad indicator for success. So we get this down to the actual order margin, which we achieved in this historical time frame. As a second step, we know that the first order is not everything, and that's precisely what Dan described on the customer-based corporate valuation. We'd like to now get a sense for what else will these people do over time in terms of margins they will generate of a certain time frame lying in the future. So on the order margin, we add this residual CLV, and then we already have a more precise understanding. And last but not least, and that's a very marketing specific point, not every channel is fully incremental, and there are certain even segments of specific channels like retargeting, which tend to have a much lower incremental impact. So we try to factor this out and give channels which are probably rather at the top of the funnel more credits because they tend to show a higher incremental impact, and we bring down bottom funnel channels which tend to be less incremental. And this way we come to more accurate figures for the historical performance. So this will be the first time where we actually look beyond just revenue and take the future margins as well as incremental impact into account, which allows us to actually get some decent understanding of the real true value these marketing campaigns have generated. So once we have that understanding, what we can then do, we can take a look at different channels. And if we take a look at channel performance as it's usually being tracked, all we would see is the nominal non-incremental ROAS. So this does not factor in any repeat purchases, no CLV, and it also does not contain incrementality. And oftentimes what we see is that these different channels are relatively leveled in their efficiency. However, if we drill down these two levels and we incorporate future margins we expect to come in, and we also factor in the incremental impact, then we start seeing massive differences. And at the bottom in this bar chart here, you see, for example, that in programmatic remarketing has a negative CLV ROI. So it's actually, if we factor in new customer acquisition plus incrementality, this channel doesn't look really nice. In contrast to this, on the very right, we see social prospecting. It could be Facebook, Instagram prospecting, which tends to show a much higher incremental impact, but also it's a prospecting channel where we attract many, many more new customers. So what we then do in order to assess the real potential of pivoting from a revenue optimization to this CLV approach is we simulate what would happen if we start reallocating budgets from channels or segments of channels to other channels which show a higher return. So in this case, we pull budgets away from the very left, remarketing, social remarketing, and we put it to the prospecting channels to the right. And this way we gain a pretty decent understanding of how much increase in long-term incremental value these campaigns can actually contribute going forward. So this is still all based on a fixed given budget. However, who tells us that this budget is optimum? And so there's a different approach. Once we gain that level of understanding, we can also take, and this is all dependent on different time horizons. So depending on the specific needs of a company, they might want to optimize campaigns just for profitability on the first order, maybe not enough cash at hand. Or they might decide, let's rather invest more heavily, take a 12-month time horizon, and then maximize profitability over this 12-month time horizon. So what you see in this chart here is that it's initially unprofitable. So we spend today, and then over time, we win through repeat purchases, we win performance back, and then this becomes profitable over time. And it might also be that another company has a really long-term focus and wants to take a more aggressive 24-month CLV approach. In this case, you would really invest heavily into new customer acquisition today. You do this because you know that the more new customers you can win today with this higher spend, the more repeat purchases you get in over time, and you could yield a much higher profitability over time. So these are different scenarios which can be played back, and based on the individual limitations of specific companies, they can then choose what they want to have and set the budget accordingly, which usually happens exactly at the interface between finance and marketing. So let's take a very brief look at what needs to be done in order to execute this. And we do not have enough time today to dig into every detail, but let me outline at least what needs to be done. So the results you saw on the first charts, this was a setup which is described here. So first of all, you need an audience setup. So you need to segment out audiences roughly. You have to separate it into prospecting and retention, and you can really slice your audiences in a more granular way. As a second element, what you need to do is you need to get your order level tracking right. So instead of just tracking the top line revenue, you need to go drill down to margins. You need a new customer flag. So is it a new or existing customer? And you need to factor in returns, because in retail, at least if it's fashion retail, returns play a highly important role. And then what we do is we do CLV predictions, and we do these predictions right at the point of time when the first purchase of a new customer happens. So someone purchases, and we take a look at the actual order. So what was the size of the orders and the revenue generated? What is demographic data from the one who purchased? Then we might take a look at web or app engagement, and we put these into the prediction models. So we take this historic information, we train the models, and we use the prediction models to calculate or estimate a residual CLV, which is then put back alongside the order level tracking. So the first margin we already have tracked. This is put then in real time into the biddable media systems. And combined with this audience setup, these algorithms will actually start optimizing towards what really matters. And if we put back revenue information into biddable media systems, what these systems will of course do, they will optimize against the numbers they see. So if you just give them revenue, they will maximize the revenue out of a given budget. Means that they will chase down the cheapest revenue they can find, which is sell to existing customers, don't spend a lot of money to acquire the highly valuable new customers. They tend to overspend on areas which show high return rates, but that's not precisely what we want to do. So in order to get them to optimize against metrics which truly matter, you have to inform these biddable media systems with the right data, and then the same algorithm which could be leveraged before for revenue optimization will now be much smarter and optimized against where the value is. So basically, implicitly what happens is that the biddable media systems will pull budget away in areas where you tend to just acquire revenue at low margins, sell to existing customers, and it puts these dollars against way more valuable segments. And that's actually a really effective approach, which also doesn't take long, so that you can truly influence your corporate valuation through marketing. And with this, I would hand back to Mark, who would wrap this up and open the Q&A as well.
Thanks a lot, Andy, and thanks to Peter and to Daniel as well, guys. Really compelling content, and what I found very interesting in hearing it is that where Peter and Daniel were fairly tactical, but really broadly strategic, talking about a little bit of change management, a little bit of cross-integration work that has to happen across the organization. Andy's work is a little bit more tactical, a little bit more specific to actually putting this into practice. And it seems like the combination of what Theta's doing on one end from an organizational perspective matches up really nicely what Crealytics is trying to do from a tactical perspective. There's a concert there that really could be explored. We did receive a slew of questions, and thanks everyone. If you still want to take a minute to put in questions, we have a few to get through them. And I'm going to bring these up without a lot of context. So I'm just in the order in which they were presented, might give some indication to who was speaking at the time. Peter, during your session, Jennifer asked, financial models try to predict the cash flows or revenue directly. With CBCV, you need to predict 4 different values, it seems like: acquisition, retention, ordering, and spend. Does the prediction of the 4 values lead to better results than just predicting one value?
Absolutely, there's no question about it. First of all, you'll get more accurate forecasts if you understand the composition of the revenue, instead of just saying this big, massive number that has lots of noise going on and just running some regression thing on it, which is the way it's done. If we can decompose it and understand each of those pieces and then put them together, not only will we have more accurate forecasts over longer horizons, but we'll also get diagnostics about each of those components. So to the extent that revenues are, say, plateauing, is it because we're not acquiring as many customers, they're not staying around as long? So we can actually start to take better actions when we see changes in that revenue or cash flow as well.
Very interesting. Daniel, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we'll see certain cases where companies will have really bad retention, and the revenue could be growing really quickly. And sure, you could kind of take that historical revenue growth and just extrapolate that many years into the future. But what we might say is, again, this is a company that's creating revenue growth purely through customer acquisition. It's going to be much harder for that company to move into profitability. So in cases like that, the naive approach would really not fare very well. I think this would be the way to really be able to tell when and if the company is going to move into profitability.
Here's a question for everybody across the board, actually. So why don't we start, Andy, with you, and then if Peter and Daniel wanted to chime in. This person says that they're responsible for digital advertising within their large technology company, e-commerce organization. They're trying to get their company to orient towards customer centricity, but it's slow going. They've been at it for 2 years, and it often feels like they're the only person speaking about this. Andy, in your opinion, what's the single most important thing you can do to help their organization understand CBCV and CLV-based optimizations, and so they can start to jumpstart those efforts?
First of all, I'm well aware of exactly this problem. We all think about complexity on the technology side, building the models and so on. To actually start incorporating this, we see that it's more of a change management problem, or how to actually get organizations to take a different perspective. On the marketing side specifically, there are different, there are old KPI sets, and these KPI sets are used across the whole organization, and it's not easy to pivot to something new. So we see usually you need one very senior ambassador, someone who's actually driving such a project. This is one key element. And within this, we see that finance plays a major role. And give you one example, what tends to happen is that finance is responsible for setting the marketing budgets. And then usually what they do, they give ROAS targets. So whoever is optimizing marketing campaigns is then tasked to get the most revenue out of a given budget. However, the finance guy, as he's smart, what he sees is the profitability of these orders, new customer acquisition, and towards the end of the cycle, he will see, oh, but my expectations are not being met. There are fewer new customers and lower margins, higher returns, so I tighten the ROAS target. But they need to understand that by setting that target, this is where the mistake happens, because acquiring valuable new customers is not a byproduct of some fuzzy optimization. It's actually something you can drive. So my recommendation is get finance to set the right targets and get rid of shadow KPIs like ROAS.
I see Peter and Daniel both nodding their head vigorously on this one. Do you guys want to shade on this, or we can just move on to the next question if there's nothing to add?
Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I think, yeah, to Andy's point, oftentimes companies aren't necessarily instrumented properly yet. So, a question could be how you could get the executive level buy-in to be able to make the investments necessary to do what they need to do. Hence the need to be able to get that executive on board. So, yes, I don't know the best way to get a high-level executive excited. I think one thing that we've often done is just kind of directly, do a webinar or speak with the team. But something like that, just to socialize the ideas and get those people in the room. I think it really helps to be able to kind of have that high-level alignment before being able to get the budget that you need.
Next question is a little bit more granular. Ali asks, what's the time window? And I think this is more towards you, Daniel. What's the time window of purchase that you used in your analysis to make sure that earlier cohorts and later cohorts have the same playing fields? The example that they spotted was between 2013 versus 2017 as an example.
Yeah, this is why you really need to use. My understanding of the question is, over what horizon are you looking at the value of a customer over? And customers that you acquired earlier, you have more years of directly observing their purchase behavior. We'll do kind of an indefinite horizon forecast when we predict what customers are worth. So it implicitly puts everyone on the same level playing field, that we're just getting the value of those customers from the time they were born until the time that they die. Whether it's a 2013 cohort or the 2017 cohort.
All right. I'm going to just ask one more question, and I think all of you guys can answer this one. So maybe we'll start with Peter. Greg asks, given that you're looking at acquisition cohorts over various years, how do you normalize that value given the different lengths of relationships that are in those cohorts?
That's beautiful. That's why it's more about models than data. Obviously, we're going to use the data, but we want to get to the kind of true underlying unobservable propensities for people to be acquired, stay around, make repeat purchases. And there's no doubt that for an older cohort, we'll have a little bit more confidence in those underlying parameters, but we can, putting that aside, make apples to apples comparisons across the newer and older cohorts and look for dynamics that are occurring not to the raw data, but to these propensities. Are the retention propensities getting worse as we roll from one cohort to another? So the models themselves will do that normalization automatically, and also let us to project ahead to new, not yet acquired cohorts as well.
Thanks, Peter. Guys, we only have a minute or two left. So if you don't mind, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping, I should say, here at the end. This is the first in a series of webinars that Crealytics is hosting. So I invite all of you, including the speakers, to come back in 2 weeks. We're hosting Sur La Table, and we're going to continue the conversation about measurement, CLV advertising. Allison Dreiblatt is the general manager and head of e-commerce there, and I'm expecting it to be a really engaging conversation. I know that we didn't get a chance to answer everyone's questions. I have captured them. What I'm going to do is share those with the speakers, and if they can chime in over the next few days, we'll get answers back to everyone who did ask a question. And mostly, I just wanted to thank Peter, Daniel, and Andreas for coming. The content was, as always, inspiring and really just very, very thought-provoking. Appreciate you guys joining us, and thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to all of the attendees as well. Look forward to seeing you at the next event.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.